If you're a pop culture junkie who loves TV, film, music, comedy, and other really important stuff, then you've come to the right place. Get ready and settle in for Classic Conversations, the best pop culture interviews in the world. That's right, we circled the globe so you don't have to. If you're ready to be the king of the water cooler, then you're ready for Classic Conversations with your host, Jeff Dwoskin.
All right, Michelle, thank you so much for that amazing introduction. You get the show going each and every week, and this week was no exception. Welcome, everybody. It's episode 284 of Classic Conversations. As always, I am your host, Jeff Dwoskin. Great to have you back for what's sure to be an extremely popular episode for 5 people in France. My guest today is the legendary, the amazing actor Saul Rubinek. We're diving into Unforgiven, True Romance, Shttl, Warehouse 13, Star Trek Next Generation, Hunters, So Many Miracles, All in the Telling. It's all coming up in just a few seconds. And in these few seconds, Kiki Anderson was here last week. Don't miss that episode. Comedian Kiki Anderson and her amazing Indecent with Kiki Anderson podcast. Check out our conversation. Check out our podcast. Lots of goodness awaits you there. But right now, all the goodness is with me and Saul Rubinek. We're touching on a lot of his amazing projects. Saul is one of my favorite actors. As I turn this intro over to the actual conversation that we had, it kind of starts in the middle. There is no re-intro from me. Saul and I just started talking, and I just let it go. I didn't want to interrupt, start over. You know how that is. Anyway, so Saul Rubinek, you loved him in Unforgiven, True Romance, Warehouse 13, Frasier, and so much more. Sal and I just dived into a conversation of his new play, So Many Miracles, and a play he's working on, All in the Telling. And I am now going to turn it over to that conversation already in progress.
Well, So Many Miracles. Yeah, So Many Miracles is, I recently wrote my second play. My first play that I wrote that was produced anyway was a play called Terrible Advice that was on in London, directed by Frank Oz. And that was translated into German and done in Berlin. It's a 4-character middle-aged comedy about sex, betrayal, friendship that was really fun. And this new play that I wrote is, so in 1986, I took my mom and dad, who are Holocaust survivors, back to Poland to have a reunion with the Polish farmers, those who had survived by 1986, with the Polish farmers who had hidden them for 2.5 years during the Holocaust. And I made together in partnership with the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, I made this documentary film. At the same time as the documentary film came out, it was called So Many Miracles. This was also the title of the book that I had written, which is essentially a series of interviews over 10 years from 1977 to 85 or so that I had made with my parents, interviews. And that book was published by Penguin and came out the same year, 87, that the documentary film came out. It's only an hour-long film, and that played all over the world. And about 4 or 5 years ago, a very close friend of mine, whose name is Rick Cleveland, who won an Emmy for co-writing a script on West Wing and is quite a well-known television writer, 6 Feet Under, Nurse Jackie, and a number of other things, who I've known since before he was a television writer, when he was a playwright. So I've known him for 25 years. He knew my story, and he said, you still haven't told the full story. And I was kind of upset with him because I had spent so long, working on this project about my parents and interviewing them and writing a book, going back to Poland, making a documentary film. And if anything, I should be done with this goddamn subject. But he said, no, you haven't told your story, and the story about your daughter that was interesting, and your sister. And there were other things that he said you really need to write about. And I cursed him, but he was right. And I started to write a play called All in the Telling, eventually called All in the Telling, which is essentially a family history. I don't even change any names, which is about how writing that book and making that documentary profoundly affected 3 generations of my family. That is, my parents' generation, me and my girlfriend, wife, and eventually my daughter, Hannah, who's now 31, and how it affected them. And I knew that it would be an interesting piece because, or at least I kept going, because I had a feeling that it had a universal subject, that it wasn't really about Jewish people and the Holocaust. It was really about family dynamics and how history, about the subjectivity of history. That is the subjectivity of memory and how that plays an essential role in each of our family histories. And it was one of the most important things to me that drove me to continue writing this even during the pandemic. And now I've done many workshops of it, and I've got a producer, and I'm, getting it together to get a production somewhere of this play, because I'm hoping that it is a universal subject. That is how family dynamics are common no matter what nationality or culture that you're in. And with the feeling also that I've had for a long time, that if you ask the right people the right questions in your own family history, you'll find that certainly within a generation or two, that there are stories of murder, great courage, coincidence, extraordinary love affairs, cowardice, heroes, perpetrators, bystanders. The elements that are in all of the great novels that have been written anywhere are in your own personal family history, if you have the will to ask the questions. And if you're lucky enough for those people who have the answers, if you're lucky enough that they're, one, alive still, and two, willing to talk. I haven't been proved wrong yet about that. When I was first introducing the subject, because I had this documentary film about how people saved my parents' lives, it wasn't about a concentration camp. When I first introduced this subject to my daughter's ninth grade class in a Waldorf school system where they hadn't really heard the word genocide yet, and this innocent question came from one of the students who basically said, but if we all knew each other's personal history, if we all shared our own personal history this way, wouldn't genocide be impossible? Which is an innocent, naive thought, but a true one. You have to make people other in order to relegate them for extinction, or you have to look at things differently. And you can only do that if you start to understand the common humanity that exists in your own history with other people's histories, other people's tragedies, other people's Holocaust, so to speak. And that isn't an exclusive club. Because if you believe that your Holocaust, so to speak, is more profound than another person's Holocaust, that will give you a reason to drive a plane into a building. So that, with that in mind and driving me, I wrote this play called All in the Telling, which is occupying me right now quite a bit. The pandemic stopped things. It's very difficult to do workshops with actors when you're doing it on Zoom and not live. But still, that's what I've been occupied doing. That's the project that I suppose matters to me the most right now.
I love your dedication to the story and the non-inclusive way you kind of approach it, where you're telling your story, but everyone has a version of the story that you hope that they relate to in their own way. I went in kind of a little deep dive rabbit hole of you talking on YouTube and stuff about this and the history with your parents being Holocaust survivors. And I have one relative that we called him an uncle that was a survivor, never really talked about it at all. He was liberated and on April 6, 1945, and died exactly 70 years later to the day that he was liberated. And so I started to kind of dig into a little bit of his history as I was learning about your family through the many videos and tellings that you've done online. So I'm jealous that you have all this, because I realized my mom died young, my dad died unexpectedly. And it's one of those things where it's like, oh, there's so much I don't know. There's so many stories that I never thought to ask, because I just never thought, when you're young, you just don't think people aren't going to be there.
Well, I didn't do it for noble reasons, which is what my play is about. It's a very funny story, and in retrospect, it has to do with lying and bigotry and fear and all kinds of bullshit that involved me pretending I was writing a book. There was no book. There was no publisher. I lied to my parents about all of that stuff because my parents weren't accepting who I was with, who I wanted to be with, because she wasn't Jewish. And all of those things are the central comedic, universal part of the story about family dynamics. And it's what makes it, I think, more accessible as a story, that the humor in it and the father, mother, son combat and struggle. So that also, I think you find that no matter what culture you're in, especially in the Jewish culture, it is people who are in concentration camps and find it much more difficult to speak about their circumstances than my parents were never in a concentration camp. They were hidden. Everybody else died different ways and were murdered, but my parents survived together. They considered themselves very fortunate. And I was fortunate that they were willing to talk, and they were gregarious people anyway. So I was fortunate in that way. Yeah.
Based on your family background, when something like Hunters comes up, is there a hesitation or is there a certain reason like why you'll take on a role that kind of will touch on the Holocaust and Nazi hunting? And Hunters isn't the only time you've touched on that topic.
No, it was a classy project being done properly with really great people. And there was going to be controversy because David Weil, the creator, writer of the show, was telling stories about certain aspects of concentration camp that he imagined that were not exactly truthful, and that he got into some trouble about that. I suspected that might be the case, but it was an interesting character who no longer believes, in God because of what had happened to his family. And it was a really well written, and it was with great people, and there was no hesitation on my part really whatsoever about doing it. No. It was just a great project. It was really well done, and I enjoyed doing it. I'm really proud of it. I think it was a great opportunity and series to be a part of. Yeah, I'm really proud of that. More recently, though, I was asked to do a role in a film called Shttl, which is the Yiddish word for small village. There were thousands of them in Eastern Europe, and certainly Jewish ones all over Eastern Europe, not Western Europe. And they were part of the center of the cultural life of Jews in Eastern Europe. They were all destroyed. 100% of them were destroyed in those 6 years. And this one particular film was a period piece that takes place in June of 1941 in a shtetl, and I was asked to play the rabbi. The interesting thing about this film was that it was shot about 50 miles north of Kiev in Ukraine, about 6 months before the Russian invasion. They built the shtetl, a number of buildings, and made it very authentic. And the entire film was shot in the Yiddish language. So I had never performed in Yiddish before. Now, your audience may not know this, but Yiddish is essentially German. It is German. It's a dialect of the German language. However, it's written phonetically with Hebrew script, right to left. But like English, it is a Germanic language. And anybody who speaks Yiddish can pretty much understand German, and vice versa. I was a refugee kid. I was born in a refugee camp in Germany, but I don't remember any of that. I was 9 months old when my parents came to Montreal. And in Montreal, I grew up in these working class immigrant streets along with working class French Canadians. And I grew up speaking street French and Yiddish before I spoke English. So it was, in a way, it was my first, not in a way, it was my first language, along with French. And that's what my parents spoke at home because they didn't know how to speak English yet. I'd never really performed in Yiddish. I mean, I maybe have done a monologue or two for an event or something like that, but I had never performed in Yiddish. And what was interesting about me performing in Yiddish was that my father had been an actor in Yiddish theater in Poland before Hitler invaded in 1939. So when he was very young, late teens and early 20s, he had been involved in Yiddish theater and had really kind of broken away from his kind of conservative religious background to do that. He didn't get to do it much. In the refugee camp, after the war was over, he started a theater along with another man, and he performed and directed and acted in plays in the refugee camp. So in a way, as we say, I come by it honestly. Of course, he came to Canada and speak English, and he had to make a living, and small baby, and there was no way to do theater anymore. Although he did get the opportunity here and there throughout his life to do it. And in a way, I was performing in Yiddish for the first time in Ukraine, which is certainly where my ancestors come from. And in this village, Shttl village, it's done as a single shot black and white film. It's just starting to make its way through festivals now. It was at the Rome Film Festival, won the Audience Award there. After that, it was at the New York Jewish Film Festival at Lincoln Center. I saw it there. And it's going to be in the Toronto Jewish Film Festival, Washington, etc. And I'm very proud of that film. It's a really interesting film. It really shows you what life was like before it was destroyed. in that Shttl, and also, as I say, all in Yiddish. Many of the actors had to perform it phonetically. They had to learn it phonetically. And some were Yiddish speakers like me. Not many, just a couple more, were actually Yiddish speakers who had come from the Brooklyn Hasidic world, had broken away from that. So they grew up with Yiddish. Their Yiddish was more fluent than mine. So that's a connection to that period that unexpectedly came to me. That was a very profound experience, really, kind of born to do it, right? Yeah, part of my life has been about my Jewish identity, my background, and the rest, much of it has not. Much of it has to do with being an actor, doing new plays and working with new playwrights and doing indie movies as well as traditional Hollywood movies, which has nothing to do with my background particularly. So I have had this odd, I think everybody's career is odd when you're an artist. But anyway, this is my particularly eccentric career. Yeah.
That movie sounds amazing. Hopefully it'll get picked up by either in the theaters or Amazon, or someone will get it so it gets a wider release. The interesting thing about Hunters that I remember about Hunters was learning about the reality of that Operation Paperclip, which I don't think I had been aware of prior, which you talk about also in For All Mankind. In your role, you call out one of the former SS people and mention that. That was kind of a back-to-back. So that was kind of interesting. It's kind of scary to think what governments do.
Well, your audience may not be aware of what that is. Operation Paperclip was the American government's program to repatriate ex-Nazis who had whatever credentials they felt were necessary to fight a Cold War against Russia. So Wernher von Braun, for example, who was introduced to the American public by Disney and was given a hero's funeral, was in the SS and did run a slave labor camp where thousands of people died to create his V-2 rocket, which was aimed at London. And he ended up working for the Americans. Paperclip, it was called because the indentation of a paperclip in the paper was seen after they removed the Nazi background stuff so that they could be whitewashed. And there were many of them. It's just by coincidence, in the alternate reality that is For All Mankind, I played somebody who was interrogating Wernher von Braun and outed him as the SS person that he was, something that never happened in real life. That outing in For All Mankind was wishful thinking. But it was really great to play. It's just a coincidence that I had just finished doing Hunters, or was doing Hunters around the same time as we were hunting those people who had the SS background. We were vigilantes hunting the Nazis who had been brought to America to fight with the Americans against the Russians, even though they had been guilty of terrible atrocities. So we were judge and jury and executioners as a vigilante group in that series.
I was working with Pacino.
Well, he was... we worked together for around 6 months, and he really is just he operates humbly as just a working actor. He doesn't carry his fame with him on his shoulders, and he's a collaborative, generous person who was a bit shy, but except that we all wanted stories at the cast, and he accommodated once he realized that, we'd love to hear his stories of his career. And he has really good ones. That was really a cool thing. But really, he just became another one of the actors. You have to, at a certain point, you have to remove whatever starstruckedness you have. And I've worked with iconic actors before. And pretty soon, whether I was working with Pacino or Clint Eastwood or Gene Hackman or Richard Harris or any of the famous people that I did work with in my life, you get rid of all of that. You're playing a scene with another actor. And very rarely do you see any of that movie star bullshit. I can't even think of anybody who would pull that shit. Jack Nicholson, Julia Roberts, any of the bigger stars that I worked with, they were just great. I wouldn't tell you, it's not the forum for me to tell you dark stories, but I don't really have them. I mean, I worked with, my career is filled with working with wonderful artists. I'm a very fortunate person.
Sorry to interrupt my amazing conversation with the incredible Saul Rubinek, but we have to take a quick break. I do want to thank everyone for their support of the sponsors. When you support the sponsors, you're supporting us here at Classic Conversations, and that's how we keep the lights on.
And now back to my conversation with Sal. We're going to dive into Unforgiven.
Yes, you've worked with amazing people. Since you mentioned the three folks from Unforgiven, I was stalking your Twitter, and there was an article that you retweeted where you had said 5 people in France are going to see this.
That was our joke on the set, is that, listen, we all thought there was a lot of Canadian actors on that set. I think all the deputies were Canadian actors. It was shot in Alberta, right outside of Calgary, High River, Alberta. But we all used to joke about the fact that this movie was going to be seen by, 5 people in France because, it would be some indie, strange, retro Western, indie Western, because, Clint Eastwood is playing a character who shoots an unarmed 17-year-old, right? Like a sniper, and can't even get on his horse. And it was a great character, but it took him, I think, 10 years to make it. Not because he was trying to raise the money, but because he got the script when he was in his early 50s and he knew he wasn't old enough, so he waited to do it. Yeah.
It's a great story, yeah. And then also in that same article, it talked about David Peoples, the screenwriter, that Clint didn't change any of the script.
Well, people who watch these podcasts are usually quite knowledgeable now about film. In the old days, when you actually got a script and not stuff online, the original script is white. Every new version or any new page, which has got asterisks on the side, is a different color, and they date the script and then they color it. You end up with a rainbow script because different colors represent different versions, different dates where these changes happen. I think that's true online too. You get different colors now. So what was odd about that script was that it was written as an original feature film by David Peoples somewhere in the 1970s called, I think it was called either Whore's Gold or The William Money Killings or something like that. And it was bought by Zoetrope, by Francis Ford Coppola, who was going to make it himself. But Zoetrope went under in the early 80s, and the script was not owned by David Peoples. It was owned by Francis Ford Coppola. But David Peoples' agent, the story goes, sent the script, even though they didn't own it anymore, to Clint Eastwood's company called Malpaso as an example. That happens, lit agents send scripts to producers as examples of their work. And David Peoples was quite a well-known screenwriter, but he hadn't written a Western. And so they sent this Western script to Clint, probably around 1982 or so. And he said, what do you mean as an example? What about this? And they said, we don't own it. And so from what I understand, Clint called Francis Ford Coppola and said, are you going to make it? And he said, I can't. And he said, well, can I buy it? And he bought it. So David Peoples had nothing to do with it. There was a transaction between Clint Eastwood's company and Francis Ford Coppola's company. He bought the script and then waited almost a decade to make it. Now, when we shot this script, it was dated 1982, which was, I think Francis had asked for a couple of changes, some changes from David Peoples. And we had an all-white page script. And when we finished shooting it, it was still all-white page script. No changes were made in the script at all. But David Peoples didn't know that because David Peoples was not on the set ever. David told me the story. I was making a movie in San Francisco in 1993, and he lived at that time, he and his wife lived in Berkeley, and I wanted to meet him. I'd never met him. This was like 2 years after, or a year or two after we'd shot Unforgiven, and it had already won the Oscar for Best Picture. And I wanted to meet him, and I got word to him, and he said, yeah, come, this is where I live, come visit me. And I went and visited him. He told me that he had gotten an invitation at a certain point before the movie was released. It was now called Unforgiven. And he was given an invitation to come to a screening. So he flew down from San Francisco to LA, and he expected to be at some screening, big screening. But it wasn't a big screening. It was just him and Clint. In a screening room, Clint wanted to show him the movie. And I said, what happened? He said, well, it was an experience that I never had before. And it was an experience I don't expect ever to have again. Because I sat there and I watched a movie that I'd had nothing to do with for almost 20 years. And it was word for word what I wrote when I first wrote it. Nothing, it was my script. He said, writers are like these fathers or mothers who have these children and they send them out to be raised by other people. And they do what they want with these children. Every once in a while you have one child that you're refused to set out for adoption, and you hope for the best. But this was one I made some money on, and you kind of give it up. You have to, as a writer, you have to kind of accept the fact that it's going to be completely altered by a number of people. And it was an extraordinary experience to see what I'd written not changed. That amazing story.
It's an amazing story. Is it normal?
No, it doesn't happen. It only happens when a writer is the director and doing an indie movie, or when the writer is, Spielberg is, making The Fabelmans and he's co-written it. There are circumstances, of course, where it's a writer-director who's very powerful, or it's being so inexpensive that nobody's interfering. Of course it happens. It happens, I'm sure, all the time when people are making indie movies for very little money and there isn't any financial pressure except, well, there's financial pressure, but there isn't any creative pressure because the stakes are lower. Yeah, that, of course, people make scripts and are in control creatively. So you're either top AAA plus director, producer, writer who gets to do what they want until they have a failure and then they don't. Or you're making this for $1.98 and nobody bothers you. Or this.
Is it normal for like the director like Clint did to be that respectful to the writer? Yeah, I mean, like not respectful to the writer, but to go so out of his way to do a full screening for the guy who wrote this and to show
I can't answer
like
for that. I can't answer that question. I mean, I don't know what Clint does with
I don't mean
writers.
Clint in period. I don't mean specifically Clint, but just in general.
I'd never heard a story like this in all the years that nobody ever said, yeah, that's happened before. I remember so-and-so director doing a private screening for the screenwriter. No, screenwriters are, unless they're also directing, aren't that powerful, except in television. In television, the screenwriter is more powerful than the director. In television, the executive producing, the creators of television are writers. Writers have all the power, not all the power, but they are very powerful on the pecking order of things in television. In feature films, that's not the case, unless it's a combination writer-director like the Coen brothers, or they're writing their own material and they're writing, producing, and directing.
I don't want to not mention, I want to give a shout out to your amazing sideburns in that movie.
Oh, and Unforgiven?
Yeah, Unforgiven. And then, something I'll rewatch movies when I know I'm going to chat. And so, you focus in on the person that I know I'm going to be talking to. And it's cool in the movie, how you're kind of rewriting these tall tales of the folks, Bush Bob, and then Gene Hackman's character. And then just your face in the scene where Clint's killing everybody at the end, where it's like you're witnessing firsthand this event. I got the impression, I was like, this is the first time you as that author had witnessed it firsthand. Usually it's a retelling. And like you can see it on your face, like, just like, wow. Fine. I'm like, I'm 1 degree. This is me, or 0 degree. I'm like right here. I thought that was pretty cool.
It was pretty cool. Yeah.
Yeah.
It was, he had a particular way of working that was, I had never seen before and I'd never seen since, which was, I think that if I've said this before in interviews, if he wasn't a famous face, like famous actor, you recognize him anywhere. But if let's say he wasn't famous, you wouldn't know Clint Eastwood from anybody, and you were very experienced as a film person and you knew movie sets. If you walked onto that set, it would have taken you at least half an hour to figure out who the director was. Because he had a particularly, at least for that movie, I've never worked with him. I didn't work with him before that movie or after that movie, but he had a particularly quiet style about him that was essentially collaborative. I mean, once he had chosen the crew and the cast, the cinematographer, production designer, who was playing these roles, he didn't impose a vision on the proceedings. His vision was the fact that he chose the script, the fact that he cast it the way he did, that he agreed to the budget and the location that he did, and all the different people, the hundreds of people that are involved in making it. And he basically let people do their jobs. He and the designers wouldn't we had a base camp near where the base of a hill. On top of the hill was where Big River, where I forgot the name of the town. What was it called? Was it called Big River? I remember the name of the town. But the town
Big Whiskey
was built, Big Whiskey was created, and we weren't allowed to go to this town unless it was on horseback or by foot or by wagon. So there were no tire tracks ever. I remember that was, I think, his idea. I remember sitting on the set, and this older person came and sat beside me, probably in their 70s at least, and said, "What do you think of this thing?" I didn't know who I was talking to. And I just said, "Well, it's a little odd because everything looks new. I mean, all the wood in the buildings, it looks like, I guess they haven't aged them yet and they haven't weathered them yet." And he said, "Well, why would they?" And I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "Well, why would they? They were put up recently. Would they be aged?" And I turned and looked at him and I said, "I know who you are. And this is Henry Bumstead." And Henry Bumstead is one of the most famous production designers who's ever lived in the 20th century. And I said, "You tricked me. I could have said the wrong thing here." And he just laughed. And I realized that very cleverly, unlike other Westerns, this was authentic. Clint worked with a lot of the same crew that he had for other movies, so he developed a little family of people. He had to bring on certain Canadian crew because he couldn't bring everybody. But it was a very unusual situation. He also had learned from the directors that he'd worked from, especially Don Siegel, to not do many takes. He liked to have one alternate for every angle that he shot, at least one alternate, but he didn't really need more than that. But he's a very efficient director.
Turned out amazing. That was it was such a great movie. Another great movie is True Romance.
Well, that movie was a flop when it came out. That movie was a disaster because it was sold pretty much like a Christian Slater date movie. And you have to remember it was before Reservoir Dogs came out later that summer. So it was the spring of '93 that True Romance came out, and it died in one weekend. And I mean, if you released True Romance now, you'd get lineups. But it became a cult movie, but it took a while. At least my guess is it took almost 7, 8, 9 years before there was all of this around Tarantino. But Tarantino was unknown. And it wasn't directed by him. It was directed by Tony Scott. Yeah, that was a terrific movie. Absolutely. But it died really quickly. And now, it's everywhere. Screenings and anniversary screenings and special editions. And if you would have asked me while I was shooting it, I would have said, I like it, but it's a combination of violence and humor that I haven't seen in movies before. And I know that Tarantino wasn't particularly happy with it at the time because he had a darker ending in mind. And I think that he would have directed it differently. But I think that Tony Scott did an amazing job on that film.
A darker ending than everyone dying and...
Not everybody dies. No, they're alive.
Oh, you're right. Christian Slater and
he wanted to kill her. He wanted to kill them off.
That's right. They did live. They're the two. He takes it in the eye. You're the first one to go in that scene.
Am I?
Yeah, you are.
Yeah, I guess.
Your bodyguard, who I had on the show, Eric Allen Kramer, was in there. So you were all squibbed up, and Tom Sizemore shoots you, actually. That's what starts the whole thing.
Yeah.
May he rest in peace.
Yeah.
Did you ever bump into your character is sort of based on or was meant to be like a Joel Silver type character? Did you ever see Joel Silver after, and did he say anything to you?
No.
No,
I never talked to Joel Silver about being Joel Silver. I think there are 3 actors who played Joel Silver. I think there are other actors who played him. I forgot who they are. I think Steve Martin at one point played him.
On SCTV, Rick Moranis did an impression called The Larry Siegel Show, and I was interviewing Chris Cluis, and he says Joel Silver calls him and just says, "What was it like to be in a skit with someone impersonating me?" And then said, "Thank you, goodbye." So bizarre. A movie I watched recently because I was talking to Gail Ann Hurd, and one movie that you guys have in common is Dick. You played Henry Kissinger.
Yeah, I did. I played Henry Kissinger, and I really wanted to play Kissinger in the movie Nixon too. I didn't end up doing that, but I really wanted to, and I tried really hard to get that role. Yeah, I really loved doing that movie. It's another movie that kind of fell between audiences. Wonderful. Look at the cast in that movie.
Oh, it's Michelle Lewis. Almost so young Michelle Lewis. You and Ragnar, Kirsten Dunst, Will Ferrell, Harry Shearer.
Michelle Williams.
Yes, sorry, Michelle Williams. Yeah, I mean, incredible cast. I mean, like so many funny people in that movie. I remember watching it a lot when I was younger. Probably like on cable. It was making the rounds and stuff like that.
It's really good. I don't. There's a movie that isn't seen. For some reason, it has developed any kind of cult status, and it should. It's terrific. Look at the cast is extraordinary. And it's very funny and really interesting to have the Watergate point of view from these two teenagers who are like young Republicans, right?
Right. You're right. Kirsten Dunst, Michelle Williams are like 15. They become the dog walkers for Richard Nixon. It's like it's really funny. And then it's kind of got a little Forrest Gump slant to it as they inadvertently keep changing the way all these things work out. You know, a show that I started watching recently, as I knew I was going to talk to you, which was one that I missed, which I'm enjoying. I started diving into, was Warehouse 13.
Oh, it's a great series. Terrific series.
Real fun. I just to put it, I watch a lot of TV, but also just to put it in perspective, I literally just finished watching Parks and Rec. So it's not like,
Oh,
so sometimes it's like, you know, there's just certain shows that.
Warehouse 13 was a very unusual show in the sense that it was a sci-fi show that didn't, deal with aliens. It just dealt with historical objects that had been imbued with certain mystical powers that we need to protect the public from. And it sets up the premise that there has been a warehouse since Alexandria in Egypt, the library in Alexandria, and that every major culture throughout history has had a warehouse. So Warehouse 12, for example, would have been the Victorian England, and Warehouse 13 is United States. And that this massive accumulation of objects, like the way the Ark of the Covenant is put into some massive warehouse at the end of Raiders of the Lost Ark and an anonymous wooden box, that there's these extraordinary objects, and that they need to be, first of all, they need to be identified, and then agents need to be found out to find them, and then they need to be secured, and then they need to be brought back to the warehouse. And that concept is extraordinary. It's a great, great concept. And we kept violence to a minimum, and it became what I was really proud of with that show, aside from the fact that it rebranded the Sci-Fi Network when it first came out in 2008, rebranded it to SYFY, and it got great ratings, and they put a lot of money behind it showing it. So it had a big audience, great audience, big numbers. What I liked about it was that it was a family show that people could watch with their 8-year-olds. And it worked on different humor levels, and it was funny. It had a great sense of humor, not partly because I would say one of the main reasons is the relationship between Jack Kenny, who was our showrunner for most of it, the head writer, and Mark Stern, who was the head of the Sci-Fi Network at the time, who happens to be a particularly creative force as an executive with really good taste. And he and Jack Kenny got along really well. And that isn't always the case, right?
Right.
And also, the showrunner was in Toronto. They had written enough scripts in advance that Jack didn't need to be in the writer's room in LA. He could be in Toronto. When you have the showrunner on set, then you don't have to dot all the I's, and he can watch improvs and say, I think that's better than what's in the script. And it was a part of a collaborative process. So it was one of the most fun times I've ever had. And the Artie character that I played, after doing whatever, over 50 episodes, really, I got an opportunity to really explore that character. He was quite dark, funny, eccentric character. And it was probably, I've never played a role that had as many hours as that character, or as many, right? The most scenes I've ever played as a character in my life is in Warehouse 13. So I only did 8 episodes of Hunters. I mean, this is 50, 60 episodes of a character. I've never had to do that before. I mean, I did a couple of years as a recurring character on Frasier, but this was different. So I'm very proud of that series, and I hope it keeps. I hope that people keep watching it, wherever it's streaming. I think it's on Peacock. You can see the whole series on Peacock now, and I think it's getting a good viewership. I'm actually surprised that they haven't thought about rebooting that show, or whatever the verb is, of reviving it somehow, because it would do really, really well, I think.
Even if it wasn't a full series revival, it would be probably great for movies.
Yeah, it would be a great Christmas special. We used to do Christmas specials, and maybe it will start the trend right here on this podcast.
Boom, it's going to
People will start to write NBC Universal and say, we need to see Warehouse 13 again.
Are you friends with Brent Spiner?
Yeah. Brent and I worked together. We had lunch together very recently. Brent and I met in 1979. We were in a play together at the Public Theater. That's where we met, and we stayed in touch with each other. And then I did, in the second season of Star Trek The Next Generation, I played turned out to be an iconic character who kidnaps Brent And then Brent and I did an entire season of Warehouse 13 as kind of a nemesis. He was a nemesis character to my character, Artie. So yeah, we've stayed in touch with each other.
There was a video that I found where he was like, he was just talking about how much he loved you on YouTube. And he was telling the story how David Rappaport.
Oh, right. How I got the role. Yeah, it was a very sad story. Yeah.
Very sad story. And that him and the director knew you. And they're like, who could we get? And they're like, oh, Sal's in town. He's in town.
Well, your audience isn't going to know why it's a sad story. Before I got cast in this role, it was a character in a Star Trek Next Generation episode who had already filmed for 2 days and then attempted suicide, which he eventually succeeded in doing a year later. But at that point, they had to recast. It was sad in that sense. And I happened to be in town. I happened to be in LA visiting a friend, and then both the director, who I'd known for years, Tim Bond, and Brent suggested me, and I was approved. And I ended up having to go there in the middle of the night and to the Paramount lot and create a whole new costume and makeup for that character. Yeah, 1989.
Very sad story. I did. You mentioned Frasier. I did have a question for you. So in your first episode as Donnie, you have a food orgasm over a corned beef sandwich with spicy mustard. Spicy, not yellow.
I have no idea what you're talking about.
Man.
So let that go.
All right, let that go.
From your own Detroit Jewish background, where yellow mustard must be de rigueur for a corned beef sandwich, I'll leave that to your particular eccentricity.
My wife's like, he won't know what you're talking about. I'm like, it's important.
It's just an eccentric Jewish Detroit thing where that says way more about you than about a corned beef sandwich.
You just show up everywhere. I mean, Schitt's Creek, Curb Your Enthusiasm, Miss Maisel. You're just, you're so blessed. I mean,
You're talking about the life of an actor.
Yeah, I know.
I mean, most actors who are working have to show up everywhere or the bank will take their houses away. You work, you do different things. You do episodic television, you do scripted podcasts, you do TV movies, you play different roles in different small movies and big movies, and you do a play every now and then when you can afford to, and you keep working so that you can pay the bills and do what you need to do. But that's only 10% of the actors who actually who are members of SAG-AFTRA and Equity. 90% is the lowest paid union workforce in the world. 90% of the actors who have union cards from the job of acting make probably less than $10,000 a year from acting. 90% make less. 90%.
Wow.
What other union are you going to talk about? So when you say you turn up everywhere, any working actor will turn up everywhere. You look at any actor who actually works for a living as an actor, and there are hundreds of us who are pretty much in my position, who aren't movie stars and who can't get things made just because they've agreed to be in them. They're not going to get financed because of our names, and we're not bankable. But we have a reputation, whether it's for the last 8 years or the last 50 years, because we're collaborative. We haven't gone into rehab too often or whatever. We're easy to get along with. We're not junkies we don't abuse our fellow actors. We're just working artists. We all turn up everywhere. It's because it's the only way we can make a living.
Well, I love when you turn up. That was my point.
Thank you.
Yeah, make your magic in all these cool shows.
That's very kind. Thank you. But I'm glad I got to speak about Shttl. I'm glad I got to talk to you about All in the Telling. I do have to go. I have a meeting I have to go to, but it's a pleasure to talk to you. Thank you so much for watching so many of my films. Let's meet again, and I can tell you stories about other movies, I'm sure. And maybe I'll get All in the Telling actually produced. We're looking for investors for that. If anybody's interested in investing in this project that I told you about, they can get a hold of my manager and they can find out who that is online. I'm happy to put a plug in for trying to raise money to produce that play because it's really worthwhile. And I appreciate the time that you spent with me. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I really appreciate it. All right. How amazing was Saul Rubinek? It was so great to hang out with Saul, ask him about Unforgiven and Hunters and learn all about his background and All in the Telling, So Many Miracles, Shttl. So great. Everyone definitely take to X or Twitter, whatever you call it these days. Let's get that Warehouse 13 revival going, huh? We can do it. We can do it.
Also, tweet at me, comment at me, email me. How do you eat your corned beef sandwich? Is yellow mustard really just a Detroit thing? Have I been living a lie these years? Do I need to try something else? Well, let me know. Anyway, so much Sal for you to dive into. Check out all the projects we talk about. Check out his IMDb. There's 1,000 more we didn't even get into. Well, with the interview over, that can only mean one thing. I know, the episode is over. I can't believe it either. Another huge thank you to my guest, Saul Rubinek. And of course, a huge thank you to all of you for coming back week after week. It means the world to me, and I'll see you next time.
Thanks so much for listening to this episode of Classic Conversations. If you like what you heard, don't be shy and give us a follow on your favorite podcast app. Also, why not go ahead and tell all your friends about the show? You strike us as the kind of person that people listen to. Thanks in advance for spreading the word, and we'll catch you next time on Classic Conversations.